fantastic. And I think, you know, I think this is such an interesting and evolving and emerging topic. You know, the landscape of work is continually changing. You know, even if we look back before the pandemic, there was all sorts of stuff that was starting to change. And, you know, some of the seeds of flexible and distributed working, it wasn't called hybrid working then. I think I was talking to somebody the other day and it was kind of like teleworking. Somebody I was chatting to on Monday at a big event I went to, you know, he's been tracking kind of teleworking and remote working since 1993. So we're kind of not in a brand new topic area. But of course, what we are really trying to get our heads around is what has happened as a result of the massive shifts caused by the pandemic, where we all had to work from home. And then for me, what's been most fascinating and has been informing a lot of my kind of research and work over the last 3 or 4 years is what has happened as a result of that. So what I want to focus on in our time together today is to think about, irrespective of what guidance, rules, mandates you're working with, how can you make this thing called hybrid working work for you and your organizations? So do you want to just go on to the next slide for me, Lee, please? So just a little bit about me and my background. So I've been an organization, an OD consultant, change, transformation, leadership development since, oh gosh, I think it's now 23 years. Prior to that, I was working within an organization. My background is retail, and I spent a lot of time on the retail operations side, in stores, sales, commercial roles. And then towards the end, I was then involved much more in transformation and culture change work. So I'm always fascinated by people, behaviors, choices that we make, how we relate to each other. But I've been as I said, I've been really curious and involved in this world of remote, hybrid, what I call omni-working, over the last 3 or 4 years. So I wrote my first book, which is on the slide there, From Physical Place to Virtual Space. I wrote that right at the beginning of the pandemic. So it was published in February 21. And it was as a result of a big change project that I was leading. And we got everything set up to work with a group of organizations. I think it was 6 businesses in the same group who wanted to create a very specific model of leadership for them. Very highly regulated organization, and you know, it was time for them to really think about, what does our leadership need to look like. Everything was set up for it all to be run in person. Lockdown happened, chief exec phoned me and he said, can you do this virtually? And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure I can. And so from there, that was the genesis then of the book that was written, and the genesis really of my interest in how we as leaders, managers, consultants, human beings navigate our way through all of the different changes. Omni-Working was written last year as part of my research for my doctorate. I'm in the final stages of my doctorate now, and it's on the evolving landscape of work. And so I did a lot of research sort of 12, 18 months ago about how organizations and leaders had reimagined or not their organizations and ways of working as we started to open up businesses and offices again post-pandemic. So that kind of is just a little bit of background. Flexpert strategist is kind of a label, a name that was given to me from an article that I wrote, which I kind of quite like, really. So I've used it as my tagline as well. But I'm just really interested in all of the contextual pieces that are shaping this evolving landscape of work. And Lee, if you can go on to the next slide. What I want to do today is to really share what I think are the key trends. Some of them are strategic long-term mega trends that I want to share with you. Some of them are very current around what's actually happening. What are the important trends that are happening right now around flexible and distributed working, and the impact of that on performance, on engagement, and on managers. So there's some things from a very strategic perspective, but then also I like to look at things from a very tactical, practical perspective as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of a blend of all of those things as we go through our time today. I want to introduce you to the Omni-Working framework, which from my perspective is my guide that I encourage leaders to think about and to follow, because I think at the moment we've been overly focused on the where of work. Should people be in the office? If they're in the office, how many days a week should it be? How much should they be able to work from home? And I think where, it's part of the picture, but I think we've got really distracted and focused far too much on where, and what we're not doing enough of is focusing on how we work, because I believe that that's where some of the real gains, some of the real shifts about becoming highly effective teams and highly effective organizations will come from changing the ways of working based on what our employees want and what the technology, the emerging technology is enabling us to do. It's going to be the blend of both of those things that create the modern workplace. I want to share 5 important shifts for successful hybrid working. And it's also an opportunity for you to share and learn from each other, because we will be, I'm going to ask you to do some work on Mentimeter so we can kind of get a bit of sense of what different environments different people are working in. And also you'll have a chance to go into a couple of breakout rooms as well. But if you can move on to the next slide, Lee, the first question I've got for you is, what brought you here today? You know, what was it about this session where you went, actually, do you know, I'm going to carve out that time in my busy afternoon? And what question are you holding? So I can try and make sure that I answer that question then for you in our time together. So I'd just like to ask you to have a think about that and to just put your answers into chat. Lovely. So there's some really great questions there coming up about how do we engage teams, and maybe overcome some resistance, whatever that resistance may be towards. And it's definitely not a one size fits all. And so how do we be consistent, and how do we be fair? Question there about neurodiversity, benefits of hybrid working, and yeah, it's an optimum policy. Okay, well, hopefully some of those things I'll answer as we go through. I might not have time to go into all of those in depth, but I can certainly, if there are any specific questions at the end that I haven't had a chance to answer, I can signpost you to some extra resources. There is masses of research out there. That's certainly a topic that a lot of people are doing huge amounts of in-depth research into. So it's, as I said, it's all starting to continue to emerge. So if you want to move on to the next slide, Lee, here's a little bit more input for you. So you can access this quiz. There's a few questions. I think there's about 5 questions on which are set up on Mentimeter, and you can access it in one of 2 ways. You can either go straight into the QR code, which should take you straight to the link, and I've opened up the presentation so you can start to contribute answers there, or you can go to menti.com and put in the code number that hopefully Lee's put, yeah, lovely, Lee's put that into the chat. So this is a snapshot of where everybody's working today. This is a snapshot of how many days a week people work either in the office or on site, depending on what your role is. This is the flexible working approach. So some of you have full flexibility to choose, and some of you are having days set by senior leadership. And again, a mix across, some of you are responsible for setting the strategy, making rules, making the hybrid rules work for your team, or you're in an internal enabling role. And there's, all right, so that's just given us a bit of a flavour. What I want to do now is to go through the trends. So one of the important trends is about what's actually happening regarding where people are working, and organisations that offer some form of flexibility. So this research data, I follow 4 or 5 different people and different research groups. So there's a great data source of something called the Flex Index. which is run by some guys out on the west coast of the States. They now have 9,000 organisations from around the world who contribute every month to update and create a picture of flexible working approaches in their organisations. And some of them are massive, you know, Procter & Gamble, big global organisations, and some of them are really small local organisations. There's also a search feature that is on there. So for people who are looking to get a job in an organisation that offers flexibility, you can go on, you can search on the database, and it will say, this is the flexible working approach. We have 3 days a week in the office, or people have complete freedom to choose which days they come in, you know, depending on the work that they're doing. So it's a really good source of data. Also from Gallup, from Slack, from Harvard Business Review, Stanford University, there's a great professor there, Nick Bloom, who has been doing longitudinal research on remote working, teleworking, flexible working since 1993. He was the guy I was talking about from Monday. So there's a lot of a source of data. But what the big trend, which I think is really important, is there are increasingly more and more organisations who are offering some form of flexibility to their employees, to their workers. That's gone up from this quarter last year by 12%. So now almost 70% of organisations offer some sort of flexibility. So that's definitely the bigger trend. The declining one is requirement for people to be in the office 5 days a week. So flexibility typically is offered somewhere between 2 and 3 days a week. And different organisations have different policies about, you know, some mandate certain days, but some just say, I want you to be in the office 40% of the time or 60% of the time, depending on the policy that they have chosen. And all of these different decisions have different levels of impact on people's engagement, on the ability of an organisation to retain good team members, retain and attract good people, which of course, as this starts to roll out, is going to become something of greater significance, and I'll explain that in a moment. So do you want to move on to the next slide, Lee? Brilliant. So the next important trend is what's starting to happen. So organisations who offer full flexibility, so some form of flexibility versus mandating coming back into the office, we're now starting to see a gap opening up in performance. So the more choice and autonomy people are given, the greater the revenue growth of those organisations. The more restrictions people have and the more people are mandated and told what to do about where they work, then that's having a slower impact on growth. And there is certainly a huge emphasis placed on trying to measure and identify productivity, which when you look into it as a subject is something incredibly subjective. The original research on productivity was done in data inputting centres in India. That's the baseline research on productivity. And there is no set measurement for productivity. So what started to happen is people have started to kind of go, oh, well, people don't look as busy. If they're not in the office, then how do I know what they're doing? You know, people aren't attending meetings, or people are slow to respond to emails. And I'm kind of going, well, that's activity. That doesn't necessarily mean it's productivity. Doesn't necessarily mean people are focusing on delivering the outcomes that their role requires of them. And often people and organisations aren't clear enough about what it is that people are there to deliver. And I think that's one area as leaders and managers in the kind of work that we do, is to help people get clear about what are the outputs that are required, what are the outcomes that are required, rather than the activity and the inputs. So there's a big shift there for me that will help relieve this productivity paranoia. And Nick Bloom just published some research, in fact, about 2 hours ago. So this is incredibly hot off the press. They've just done a 6-month study about working from home 2 days a week, 3 days a week in the office. So that's the sort of the 3-2, which is a very common pattern. Before the trial started, managers were concerned that productivity and output was going to dip. They reckoned somewhere between about 3%. By the end of the 6 months, they actually reckoned and were starting to be able to prove and measure that productivity and performance actually increased. What happened was they were holding on to good people, so their retention rates went up, particularly retention rates in ethnic minorities, in females, in caregivers, and in neurodivergent populations. So having that flexibility and freedom about choice and autonomy about where to work, it really does. So somebody was asking for sort of evidence about, you know, how do we do, what evidence do we have about remote working? Sorry, I'm trying to find the question as well. Neurodiversity. So evidence now is starting to be developed about caregivers, about minority people who may feel less comfortable in an office environment due to microaggressions, and certainly neurodivergent populations. It's a better working environment for them. And that also needs to be balanced with togetherness, with times where people come together, because that's hugely important as well. So let's move on to the next one, Lee. Okay, so these two organisations, there's lots and lots of examples out there, but these two organisations for me, Atlassian and Allstate, there are two different approaches to how do we help make hybrid working work in the best way possible. The first one is by creating team level agreements. So that means within the team, they have an element of choice and flexibility within a wider framework of working. So how do we organise ourselves? How do we communicate? How do we give clarity of output and expectation and keep the visibility of our progress high? And they do that by team level agreements. It's also done by MasterCard, Unilever, Microsoft. I mean, these are huge organisations, and they've worked out that this is the best way for teams to be able to have autonomy and choice about how and when they come together within a wider framework set by the organisation. Because flexibility, choice of flexibility, isn't just location, it's also schedule. So there are two aspects of it. And again, more research has been done to say that having schedule flexibility, so being able to maybe start the day a bit later, end the day earlier, have a longer period of time off in the middle of the day, is equally, and in some cases more important than where work is done. So we're back to the how versus the where. Atlassian, and there is masses of research available on the internet, Atlassian have been incredibly generous with their, what they call their big social experiment about how and when they work, their distributed working approaches. So they do employee choice, which means their people can choose to work wherever they want to work every single day. But what they do say is that once every 3 months, everybody physically comes together for a period of time. It might be 3 days, it might be 1 day. It depends on the nature of the business and where they are in the world and what's going on at the organisation in that particular point in time. And they've proven that those, what they call intentional togetherness, so we come together once every 12 weeks, that then gives a boost in connection, gives people a chance to build relationships, people feel more connected, they feel more motivated, and their productivity, their performance improves. That boost lasts for about 8 to 10 weeks, and then it starts to tip off. That's when they then have the next wave of in-person events. So this balance between coming together intentionally and then teams having the freedom to go and work in a way that works for them is proving to be a hugely successful way to get to balance off some of the loneliness that people can feel and disconnection that people can feel if they're just spending too much time remotely, and not having it being so regimented that people don't feel they have any choice and autonomy to create a style and a way of working that enables them to bring the best of themselves. So next slide. So engagement, yesterday, it's really weird. We've had lots of new research appear over the last 48 hours. Yesterday, Gallup issued their global 2024 employee engagement survey results. Sadly, the UK is one of the worst in the world about levels of engagement. Globally, 23% of the global workforce classify themselves as being engaged. In Europe, it's 14%, and in the UK, it's only 10%. So there is only 10% of the UK workforce who classify themselves as being actively engaged. So for me, there is a massive, massive opportunity here, because, the engagement, we know, has such a big impact. So what's going on in that relationship between team leaders, managers, and their teams that is disrupting levels of engagement? That's one piece. What's happening around company policy, around how the organization is being run, that is impacting engagement and people feeling like discretionary effort. And what's the impact of levels of trust, levels of psychological safety, well-being? So there's all sorts of things nested into this, but I think this is one of the really, really big areas. Do you want to move on to the next one? So Henry Boot, who are a construction company based up in Yorkshire, and they actually feature in the Omni-Working book as a case study. They did an employee engagement survey, and this is fascinating because their office-based staff have been given quite a wide range of flexibility about how and where they work. Construction sites, people kind of go, well, a construction site, how do you bring flexibility into a construction site? In the employee engagement survey, there was very, very clear feedback from the construction sites compared to the office. Construction sites said, hang on a second, this isn't fair. Our office workers have all this flexibility, but we don't. Now, they could have said, tough, that's how it is. You have to be present on a construction site because of the nature of the work that we do. They chose to go, okay, let's see what we can do. They spent 8 months running a series of trials on a large construction site and on a small construction site, giving autonomy to the site manager to say, look at flexibility, look at scheduling flexibility, look at location flexibility. And they supported them through this process to be able to set and create flexibility that enabled the construction site teams, plus the work was still delivered on time and in budget. That trial has been so successful, it's now being rolled out to the rest of their construction sites over the coming weeks and months. So for me, it really shows that with the right leadership approach and mindset and willingness to explore, then there are so many versions of flexibility that can really impact engagement scores. So I think they've done a fabulous job. There's also work being done in schools, in hospitals, in manufacturing, so in other industries and organizations where it doesn't necessarily automatically lend itself to some form of flexibility. Do you want to move on to the next and the final trend that I want to share with you? And this is about managers, about what's happening for managers at the moment, because I think being a leader and a manager now is so much more complex. There's so much more to think about, there's so much more to consider, and managers, I think, are really struggling. Their role has changed so much since 2019. This recent research, over half of them feel very unprepared and under-equipped for their role as leader and manager now. They're feeling overwhelmed. You know, 82% of new managers surveyed hadn't had any training. And because of that, their tendency is to lead and manage in a way that is constantly, I want to have meetings, I want to know what's going on, I want to, so then they're just not feeling equipped either to be able to communicate, to be able to line manage, to be able to organise and create the right environment for their teams to be able to do their work. Because they need signals of progress that if they haven't worked through that, the temptation is to micromanage because there's a level of anxiety. So they're feeling anxious and overwhelmed, and their teams are probably feeling anxious and overmanaged. So those are the 4 important current trends. I want to just quickly talk about some of the mega trends because they are going to start shaping more and more what happens in the short term in organisational life, and certainly the strategy that around attracting and retaining good people. So Lee, could you just move on to the next slide, please? So do you want to just go through a bit more, go through again to the next one? Okay. So there's 2 trends here. No, you go on to that one you had done. Brilliant, perfect. One of them, some of you may have heard of Linda Grattan, who is London Business School, huge researcher into kind of the future of work and what she calls the 100-year life. And what she's noticed is this shift from what she called the 3-stage model of our working life. We would go through some education, we might train in a particular trade or a discipline or a particular topic. We'd probably work in that area for the vast majority of our working life, and then we'd retire. Working life just isn't like that anymore. We've got different life stages that may require and ask of us different things, from our first time at work to becoming parents and all of the responsibilities that come with that, maybe carer responsibilities piled on that as well. Plus then, as we move towards the end of our working life, people's financial situation may not mean that they can retire in the same way as previous generations have been able to retire. They don't necessarily want to continue to work full time. So how do you help people, rather than go off the retirement cliff, how do organisations still have access to people's wisdom and knowledge, but enable them to work and contract in a different way with organisations before working life and working time kind of tapers off rather than suddenly ends? So you then combine that with things like the gig economy, people wanting to be more freelance and solopreneur, maybe fractional working. There's all these different kinds of types of contributing to organizational life and to the economy and to the health and social care and all different kinds of ways of working that have required organizations to start to think differently about the formal and informal contracts that are happening at work. So then you're starting to get what's called workforce ecosystems, where the boundary line of an organization is starting to blur. So contracts are no longer necessarily full-time contracts or part-time contracts or specific skills coming in. Organizations are really starting to think it's becoming much more grey. How do we attract a set of skills that we actually need for a specific period of time, but necessarily not make it so transactional from a contractor perspective? How do we increase a level of fluidity and build relationships so it becomes much more transformational and relational, rather than I'm just trying to bring a set of skills in for a particular period of time? So that's another mega trend that's starting to emerge. Do you want to just move the slide on one more for me, Lee? So what we're also seeing is people wanting that there's something happening with regard to loyalty and people's resistance and reluctant to kind of give full loyalty to one employer, because people are experiencing being made redundant more often as organizations downsize and shift. So there is a desire for financial security that might come from having multiple income streams. We've got life stage transitions that are also going on. We've got 4, soon to be 5 generations within one workforce. So when you combine all of these things together, they are creating some real shifts in both an employee value proposition and also the psychological contract between people wanting to work and organisations. And then, of course, I can't run a session like this without, if you go on to the next slide, Lee, without talking about the mega trend of AI. And press again, brilliant. No, back one, that's it. You know, and artificial intelligence, the automation, augmentation, how that fits into training and learning and development, which is what, Amy, you were talking about early on, how we actually use data, what data analytics and data insights, generative AI, and how that's starting to change the landscape of work, people's desire for more personalization, and then all of the ethics and cybersecurity that goes around that. So I think it's a really, I think it's a fascinating time, but it's also throwing up some real organizational challenges, which are starting to impact organizations now. So I think we've got the 4 trends that I've talked about of what's actually happening around the trends of where people are working, of performance, of employee engagement, of what's happening with managers, combined with these mega trends, which creates a really, really important melting pot. So just listening into some of the conversations that were happening in the breakout room that I was part of, I think there were 2 things which really struck me in that conversation. The first one was about the skills and the approach of the line manager and just how much impact they have on how that team feels, how that team chooses to work. And I haven't got time today to go into team agreements, but for me, that is probably the biggest recommendation I would make for any organization, is to work at a team agreement level and to upskill and get managers to think differently about how their teams work and why they're bringing people together. So that's the first thing that really, really struck me. And the second thing, which is what I always say, is there is no one size fits all. So you may see a team doing this over here, but that may not be right for your team, depending on what it is that a different team is there to deliver. So anyway, let's continue our conversation. So Lee, would you mind just moving the slide forward? So just that's it, perfect. So these are my thoughts. You know, I don't think hybrid is the most helpful label. Obviously, I prefer Omni-Working because it's the name that I've created based on the kind of the research that I did. I think some of this I've covered already. How is more important than where? I think we've just been too distracted by return to office, work from home. The important things are how people work, that they are equipped with the behaviours and the relationships and some foundations and enablers. And I'm going to come on to that because that's how the Omni-Working framework is constructed and created. Managers, human-centric managers, are really, really important. Autonomy and choice is key for engagement. And I think organisations are starting to get left behind because they are being too fixed and too rigid. Maybe some attitudes at a senior manager level are still very much in this is how it used to be, I want to go back to that. And I think stuff has changed so much around expectations now, supported and enabled by the advancements in technology, that we're never going to be able to go back to how things were in 2019. And honestly, I don't think we should. I really don't think we should. So do you want to just click on again? So I think there is a real opportunity for a source of competitive advantage around recruiting and attracting talent. And flexible working absolutely should be part of an operational strategy and not seen as something that as a perk or a benefit that HR should manage. and just sign off people's flexible working requests, because it's way, way, way beyond, you know, mums who need to leave early for the school run. That's still a hugely important part of it. But why is it just mums who leave early for a school run? You know, in the example I gave with Henry Boot, one of the guys on the construction site was like, do you know, I can go and watch my grandson play football, and that's so important to me because I wasn't there enough when my kids were growing up. And that sort of stuff, I think, is some of the hidden opportunity around flexible and distributed ways of working. So I want to move on now and talk to you about the Omni-Working framework before I give you a chance to do some more work in breakout groups. So this is the framework. It's surrounded by a sense of belonging, because belonging is such an important factor, even more so because we know that if people are solely working remotely and they don't have enough connection and they don't have enough relationships with people at work, then that impacts people's well-being and mental health. So creating a sense of belonging, but doing it in such a way that people are enabled through the technology and the space, and there are leaders and managers who can create really human-centric ways of working. So each of these 7 kind of circles, really, which are interconnected, and you know, this is also systemic. Everything relates to and influences and affects everything else. These are the topics that, when I spoke to all of the people I spoke to and did all of the research that I did, came out as the most important topics. Now, some of them you'll kind of go, well, actually, is that any different in terms of a topic being important? Build trusted relationships, that's always been important. But because the context has changed, it becomes even more important now that we spend time and effort focusing on it. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Lee? So the enablers, you know, technology, providing enabling technology is so fundamental to enable people to have a digital workspace that works for them, so that they can access everything they need to be able to do the work that they are there to do, irrespective of their location. And we've got a long way to go. I mean, I was at what I would consider to be a very forward-thinking organisation's office on Monday with a number of colleagues of mine who get equally as excited as I do about this space. Somebody from outside the organisation had brought their presentation on their laptop. They couldn't connect it to the equipment in a very well-equipped meeting room because of firewalls, because of all sorts of coding and all sorts of stuff. So again, that's just another example of how technology can sometimes trip us up when we're trying to work in a fully flexible way with our own digital workspace. The next one along, designing working spaces, not just the physical office. What's my working spaces in a third space? What's my working spaces when I'm working at home? When we do physically come together in the office, what's the office configuration like? Do I need to reserve a desk? Do we have team neighbourhoods where my team comes together? Is everybody trying to come into the office all on the same day? So the office is packed midweek, and then there's nobody else there. If I'm there on a Tuesday, I'm sitting here on my own and all I'm doing is sitting on Teams meetings. So there's a lot of work going on and a lot of work still to be done about the physical manifestation of an office and all of the estate implications for organisations about how much office space do they need? What leases do we have? When are those coming up? Do we own the building? So there's all kinds of strategic financial implications, as well as the practical and tactical day-to-day, how we're going to configure our office spaces. The guiding principles are those overarching organisational principles that say, this is our view of flexible and distributed working. Within that, we let the teams decide themselves how things are done on a day-to-day basis. I'm coming back to team agreements again around these Omni enablers. Do you want to move the slide on to the next slide, Lee? Brilliant. And then the behaviours then across the top, These are human-centric managers and teams interacting, so they're able to cultivate connections within their own team, but also across different teams when they recognise who it is who they need to interact with and collaborate with in order to get their work done. We've got trusted relationships, we've got optimizing working practices. And in this, I'm talking about things like the balance between synchronous and asynchronous working. For me, is a massive example. How much of stuff are we still expecting people to do all at the same time, all on a Teams meeting, or all on a call together, or all physically in the room together, versus unpicking some of our long-held habits around how we update each other, how we communicate, and what the purpose is of a meeting. So how much can we decouple and say, actually, we don't need to all do that at the same time. We just need to have good document management systems, good access to shared drives, so people can work on things in their own time and in their own space, and be a bit more organized and thoughtful about team chat channels, project channels, and how we use whatever configuration we've got of 365 or any other platforms that are used as well. And then the final one on here is deliver outcomes, which is all about being much more outcome focused rather than, as we spoke about earlier on, about activity. You know, am I there to answer the phone because somebody's trying to phone me? That shows I'm not doing any work. Well, actually, it might be that this is the time where I need to do some really quiet, heads down, focused work. And I'm intentionally saying, this isn't a time to be disturbed because I really do need to concentrate. But how do we make those agreements, and how do we flag those things up for other people in a way that helps me set and hold some boundaries? All those things for me come within team agreements. So Lee, let's move on to another slide. Keep going through. Let's just get that whole slide up. Brilliant. So I think high performance flexibility and making hybrid working work is about how we work in 3 different areas, 2 of them very operational. So how do I improve and increase what I call my personal omni-wow, my personal organization, how I set up my day, how I set myself up for success. Then doing that at a team level, and these are very tactical, operational focused. And then the third one then is how we focus strategically at the organization's operating model, because flexibility needs to be seeded in across every aspect of the operating model of the organization. Next slide. So these 5 essential shifts that I think are really important in making hybrid working work. So if you want to go on to the next slide. So you'll see that this effectively is a little bit of a summary there of the things that I've been talking about. So embedding flexibility into the operating model, giving teams the autonomy to decide where and how they work through team agreements, making sure that there's asynchronous working is more enabled. Now, whether that is an investment in technology or whether that is actually just opening up more apps and more of the things that are already available within Teams, within the 365 platform. So many different organizations I work with have certain things opened up in 365 in some organizations and blocked off in others. It's all there available, and it's really hard for me to kind of go, have a look at this or have a look at this, because it needs to be set at an organization level. And it's only when people go back to their IT services team that they kind of go, oh yeah, no, we haven't opened that up, or oh, that's really easy to do. So there's a little bit of, I think, interrogation of the art of the possible versus what has been permission has been given for. But asynchronous working, I think, is a massive opportunity. Create this rhythm of intentional gatherings so that there is that balance of freedom and autonomy, but within a framework. And, you know, Atlassian, they've discovered that it's once a quarter. Other organizations, it might be more frequently, or it might be less frequently. There isn't one size fits all. I always encourage organizations to experiment. And then I think the final shift is about developing flex-able leaders and managers who are able to really understand what's needed to be able to work in the best way with their teams. So if you want to move on to the next slide, Lee. And again, just keep, yeah, it's a build slide, so we'll just build that through. So we've got all of the trends that we've talked about, the five important shifts. And for me, that's where the change agenda comes in. So being able to say, okay, well, if I'm thinking about all of these things, if I'm able to influence things strategically, then are we paying attention to these and how they're showing up and manifesting themselves within our organization? And then at a tactical level, what else, what am I able to do? You know, where's my intervention point as an OD practitioner or as a change manager? Where's my point of intervention here? And what level of the system do I want to intervene in? Do I want to intervene at a very individual level? So I'm going to upskill leaders and managers. Do I want to intervene at a group and a team level across the system? Or am I able to intervene and to make changes at an organizational system level? Because we've all got the different scope of the kind of work that we do, both strategically, longer term, and tactically and operationally in the short term. So for me, there's a rich tapestry here on this potential change agenda for the work that you're all doing in your respective organizations. I've got one final thing that I'd like you to do, which is going back into Mentimeter. So Lee, if you could just share the very next slide, brilliant. If you go back into that Mentimeter link that you had before, then we can do a word cloud about the 3 words that describe how you feel as you leave the session this afternoon. There you go, you can see that emerging as people contribute to it. Brilliant. I'm going to stop sharing that now because I'm just conscious that we're just coming up to 5 o'clock, and I just want to open the mics up to just invite any of you to say anything that you want to say as we come to an end.
Anybody got any questions for Gwen? Gwen, thanks again for kind of saying in terms of what you're going to share. That'd be great. And we've got a Teams channel and a LinkedIn group as well that I'll drop those in, and we'll obviously share this recording. But in the last minute or so, has anybody got anything particular that they wanted to take the opportunity to ask Gwen?
I haven't got a question, but just a thank you, really. I've really enjoyed listening to you, Gwen, and I think you've talked in a really interesting way and really explained and linked your research to what we're seeing kind of practically on the ground and the real challenges that we're experiencing. So it's been really great. So thank you for that.
Brilliant. And Kate, as you're going to be working in the New Forest, then if you're in Lymington, let me know, because it would be lovely to meet up with you in person.
For sure. Thank you.
Great stuff. Well, thank you. Or and to echo that, Gwen, I'm sure all of us on the call will say the same thing, but like I said at the start, thank you for giving up your time.
My pleasure.
The conversations in the breakout rooms kind of demonstrate, I think, what we thought about how timely a topic it is and how it is very much on everybody's agenda at the moment. So I know there's been lots of curiosity from the things that you've been sharing. So genuinely thank you, and thank you for giving up the time to come and join us, and hopefully it'll be a kind of friend of the network for a period of time beyond this as well, which would be great.
Happy to. And as I said, Lee, I will send you all of the slides and stuff. I'll try and get that done straight away now, and then it's done, and you can share it with everybody along with the recording of the session as well.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
Gwen.
To meet you all.
And thanks. Good to see everyone again, and we'll see you at the next one.